All right, so let's go ahead. Welcome our very special guest for today. Joining me now is Ranger beat writer for LowHUD.com as well as USA Today, Vince Mercogliano. Vince, how's everything going, man? It's been a while.
Pretty good, John. Like we were just saying, trying to get a little bit of relaxing time and family time and all that in during this break, but I still find myself working quite a bit. But it's nice because I'm home. Haven't really had to go anywhere in a week or so now. So it's a nice little break in the middle of the season. I think much needed, not even so much for me, but definitely for the players. It seemed like they were looking forward to this as well. So it's been cool, but we'll be getting back going, and I guess in a week from today now. So pretty soon.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as we both know, there's never a dull moment covering the New York Rangers. So, no. I figure we'll just we'll jump into the hockey stuff here, and there's a couple of things I want to get to today, obviously, but something that I've really been wanting to ask you about is, and I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that want to hear about this player as well. But that's Ryan Strome. At the beginning of the season, you hear that there aren't really any contract extension talks happening, and then it sounds like it picked up again, and then it was quiet for a while. Do you have any idea where things stand between the Rangers and Ryan Strome and what their level of interest is in bringing him back, provided that it's at the right price?
Yeah, well, you touched on it there. There is definitely a level of interest from the Rangers, provided it's at the right price. I reported on this, I want to say about 2 months ago. I wrote a story that basically I got from multiple sources that the Rangers are indeed, they've come to the internal decision, I guess is the best way to put it, that they would like to move forward with Ryan Strome for a variety of reasons. I think when you look at the potential price point and you look at the upcoming salary cap crunch that they're looking at when you look ahead, especially to next season and the next couple of years after this year, we know right now they have a lot of cap space, but beginning next year, that's going to shrivel up and they're going to have very limited cap space. So the way that they look at it is at their price point, what can they do to get themselves a legitimate second line center moving forward? How do they find somebody who fits that need, but also fits the price point that they're looking for? And I think they've come to the internal conclusion that Ryan Strome is about as good as they're going to get, they believe, at that price range. So the real question moving forward now, because they have made it clear to his side that they would like to retain him and they are open to an extension in season. I think the clock is ticking and it's looking more likely by the day that maybe that wouldn't happen until the offseason. But I know that they have had conversations. And I think for them, the key is how much is Strome looking for? Because what I was told was if they can get him in that $5 to $6 million per year range, right now he's making 4.5. So they know they're going to need to give him a raise. He's been highly productive from them. I think he's quieted a lot of the doubters. I think he's proven that he is a very capable top six center, even when he, a lot of people talk about, okay, he's good because he plays with Artemi Panarin. But even when we've seen him play without Panarin, he's still been very good. Clearly one of the most productive forwards on the team, a key player for them. I think that they're willing to go to 5.5, maybe close to 6 million on him, but it's all about what does he want? Because I do believe that he would like to stay in New York. He loves it here. He's one of the most popular guys in the locker room. I can tell you that without a doubt. He's really a guy that I think a lot of teammates like having around. And I think that he really enjoys being here. But if he hits the open market, could he do better than 6 million a year? Probably. So it comes down to how much of a discount does he want to give the Rangers? Is he willing to take a little bit less to stay here? And if that's the case, I think the deal probably gets done. But if he says to the Rangers, look, I think I'm worth 6.5, 7 million a year, the Rangers might have to say, listen, we don't blame you, but we're going to have to take a pass because the numbers, at least that I've put out there, if you look ahead to next season's salary cap, if you assume, and I've looked at about 17 players who I think you can safely assume will be on the roster. Now, that's including somebody like Morgan Barron, who you could swap out with another guy in the same price range, an entry-level type of guy. But basically the way that I've looked at it, and this people from the Rangers have told me that this is a pretty fair way of looking at it, is you can look at 17 roster spots filled with about 3, 4, 5, 6 at the most that they need to add. And they've got about $10.7 million in cap space. So if you devote 5.5, $6 million of that to one guy in Strome, you don't have that much left to pay Caco, to find a backup goalie, to do the other little things you need to do to round out the roster. So I think the number they're comfortable with for Strome, like I said, is probably somewhere between 5 and 6. But I don't think they can afford to pay anybody much above that. So that's really the question is, will Strome meet them in the middle? Can they find some common ground? or I don't think anyone would begrudge Strome, who's I think going to be 29 now, looking ahead if he wants to maximize his value and hit the open market and go for the highest dollar mark.
Yeah, I think you made a great point, and it's something that I've talked about in the past. This myth that, well, Ryan Strome, his numbers only are where they are because he's on a line with Artemi Panarin. That obviously helps. I mean, I feel like you or me, Vince, could go out there with Panarin and we might get a couple of points, but
not me. It wouldn't be pretty.
Let's be real here. But yeah, no, I mean, he's put up some of his best streaks, when Panarin's been out of the lineup. Panarin had to miss 3 weeks last year, and Strome was a point per game player and really kind of carried the team offensively. And I'm just kind of hoping that from Strome's perspective, he is a little bit of a late bloomer in this league. He was a very high draft pick, and it took him a while to kind of reach his potential. I'm just kind of hoping that, from a personal standpoint, he thinks like, you know what? I'm on a great team here. It's a young team. It's a fun team. It's an up and coming team. It's a team that could contend for a Stanley Cup. I'm playing with one of the best players in the world. I got to take a little bit of a hometown discount. I mean, and I know you're not, you don't hang out with Ryan Strome every day, but you're around him. I mean, do you sense that he's the kind of guy that might come to some kind of a conclusion like that, just kind of from a personal standpoint?
Yes, I definitely think there's a chance. I can't speak for him. I don't know for sure if that's how he's thinking, but I definitely think there's a chance. And, you mentioned Panarin. There's no doubt about it that Panarin loves playing with him. Those two are very close. So that relationship, I think, could play into it as well. I'm sure Panarin will do some lobbying to keep him around. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody could blame these guys. They have a very short, small window to maximize their earning potential before they retire and they're done with the game, and they're still relatively young men at that point. So if he can get an extra $1 million per year to go somewhere else, if you were him, what would you do? It's a tough decision. I think the Rangers are hopeful that they can find some common ground. Again, I know that they have made it clear to his side at this point that they would like to do that, but I also think they've made it clear that they can only go so high. So that sort of puts the ball in Strome's court. Maybe he's still mulling the decision. Maybe he wants to take it to the offseason. Again, I think they've had some extension talks, but whether or not it gets done in season, that's looking maybe less likely by the day, although, things could change at any moment. But I think this is really the situation they're going to find themselves in is will he meet them in their price point or will he want more? And that's ultimately going to be his call.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And, another player that I wanted to ask you about, this is somebody who, and for anybody listening, we've had Vince on several times in the past, but Vince, I remember we had you on maybe about a year ago. And I remember at the time you mentioned that the Rangers were really, really high on Filip Chytil. They felt like he had tremendous potential, a really high ceiling. And, of course, he's in, his 5th season with the Rangers now. And, he's had his moments for sure. There's times where it looks like he's on the verge of a breakout, but the points just haven't been there this season. And every now and then now you kind of hear his name come up in trade talks. Do you have any sense for what the Rangers think about Chytil as it currently stands? I mean, do they still think that he's a big part of their future, or have they become a little bit more open to maybe even moving him for like a rental type player as they, gear up for hopefully a playoff run?
There's a healthy dose of skepticism about his future for a couple of reasons. You touched on it. There have been flashes, but there definitely has not been enough consistency. His trademarks are speed and skill. And if he was putting all that together and if he was putting up significant points, I think he'd be in a pretty strong position, but he hasn't done that. I don't think they feel great about his all around play, his defensive play. There are questions about whether he can stick at center. A lot of people point to the faceoff percentage, and that's bad. So there's no denying that. But I think overall, people wonder, is playing center putting a little too much on his plate? If you move him to the wing, does he utilize that speed and skill a little more? Does it simplify the game for him? I think there's a valid argument that that's probably the best place for him. They've given him an extended chance to stick at center, and there just hasn't been, in my opinion at least, enough to say, okay, he's solidified his place as a middle 6 center moving forward. I don't think he's done enough at this point for you to feel super comfortable saying that. So I do believe that the Rangers would entertain offers for him. I don't know if I'd say they're actively trying to get rid of him, but I do definitely think he could be a trade candidate. I think that they were willing to discuss him last summer as well. Whether he's moved at the deadline this year or not, it's possible. It might be more likely in the offseason, once they reassess. I think at this trade deadline, the Rangers would be very comfortable because of all the cap space they have right now if they are going to go the rental route to not get rid of any current salary and just use prospects and picks to acquire a player who could help them now. I don't know if they're necessarily looking to subtract from their depth right now. Forward depth has probably been their biggest issue so far this season. So he could be moved at the deadline. I wouldn't completely rule it out. I definitely think that they would be open to moving him in the right deal, maybe this offseason. And I think the reasons for that are just, as you said, even though he's still young and his game could blossom at any point, because we know that there's a lot of potential and a lot of talent there. But in 5 seasons, I don't think he's done enough for you to say, okay, this guy, we got to put a stamp on him. He's definitely a big part of the future. I don't see that as a feeling around the Rangers right now.
Yeah, I've kind of gone back and forth on Filip Chytil a little bit myself, because you just touched on it right there, Vince. You know, the potential is there, and it's very easy to forget. You know, 5 seasons with the Rangers, he's still just, I believe, 22 years old.
Yeah.
And, you know, you look at somebody like Mika Zibanejad, he's on the Rangers basically because the Senators gave up on him about 1 season too early. And look what Mika Zibanejad has become. And I think that's a great point there, too, that it just seems like his game is a little bit more suited for the wing when you consider, again, he doesn't win faceoffs. He's not the most physical player out there. There's less defensive responsibility. And right wing is where, you know, the Rangers seem to need to address that area probably more so than any other position on the team, which actually leads me into another player that I wanted to talk to you about. And you actually recently wrote an article on him, and that's, of course, Vitaly Kraftsoff. And for anybody who missed it, the deal with Kraftsoff right now, he's in the KHL. They're going to dive right into their playoffs after the Olympic break here. And whenever his team is eliminated or ultimately wins the championship, that determines when the Rangers could recall him. Vince, do you get a sense that they would actually do that? Because, you know, obviously it's been a whole saga with Vitali Kraftsoff, and I don't know, maybe he's burned one too many bridges, or maybe the Rangers say, hey, let bygones be bygones, bring him back. Any sense for what could happen there in this ongoing saga with Vitali Kravtsov?
There's a lot of layers to this.
Yeah.
The number one thing to put out there is that a trade is ultimately where this is heading. I would be very surprised if he ends up being a long-term part for the Rangers. I think what happened initially here was, and there's fault on both sides, that we've all talked about this and written about this so many times, but when him not making the roster out of training camp was a questionable decision on the Rangers' part. I don't know exactly what their thinking was there. I believe that they should have anticipated that there was the at least potential for this type of reaction from him, that where he was going to be disappointed and potentially take his things and go home, which is what he did. So, but you could also, of course, put fault on the player as well. You know, I know that a lot of people have made the point that, you know, if you're assigned to the AHL, you should go take that assignment, use it as motivation, work hard, and force your way back. So I think there's some validity to that as well. But the way that whole thing played out initially, where the Rangers were being questioned for how they handled him, where he was being questioned for his own commitment, I think both sides kind of came to an agreement like, okay, neither of us are looking good right here. We need to calm things down. So I think we've seen a little damage control in the last few months. The Rangers, of course, agreed to loan him to Tractor, which is the KHL team that he has a long history with, and sort of let him play, let him hopefully continue to retain some value, continue to grow his game. And his side has been very quiet, whereas initially I think they were letting a lot of things out that were indicating that he wasn't happy, that he wanted to trade. That is very much quieted down now. So both sides are kind of playing nice, which I think is wise on both sides' parts. But realistically, could he come back and play for the Rangers? That's kind of the big question now. From the Rangers' perspective, I don't see that many reasons why you wouldn't, at least when his season is over in the KHL, recall him, invite him back, see what he does, put the ball in his court. I don't know if they would stick him right in the lineup. I kind of don't see it. I don't know if, given the way that he handled the prior situation, that they would want to reward him by just inserting him directly into the lineup. Now, injuries or COVID or whatever could happen. And if there's a need, then they could use him. But I think that if they brought him over here, they would want him to sort of work his way back little by little and earn his way into the lineup instead of just being gifted a spot. Although I'm sure many people would argue, you know, given some of the guys that they've used in their bottom six, they could use scoring punch maybe from a guy like him. But would he want to do that? And I think for him, it would be a risk to say no, because then you're risking further damaging your reputation. Now, The one thing that I think could cause the Rangers pause was I heard some whispers around the time. This is not anything that I would say is rock solid, but I think that there's some legitimacy to wondering at least how would he be received by his teammates? Because I did hear some whispers that certain guys didn't like the fact that he handled that the way that he did, that he refused to go to Hartford. We've seen many guys get sent to Hartford. We've seen many guys in other teams get sent to the AHL. We've seen high picks do it, countless times. You can look, there's a lot of examples of it, but I think there were some questions as to how was that received in the locker room. And if you bring him back, would he be well received by his teammates? So obviously Chris Drury would need to have the pulse of the locker room on that before inviting him back. But if they don't trade him at the deadline, and there's definitely a possibility he gets traded at the deadline, but I also, because of the fact that the Rangers have him under team control beyond this season, I've been told multiple times, there's no rush. We saw it similarly with the Elias Anderson situation with the Rangers. They did not like the initial trade offers that came in, especially once, when things are fresh and the wounds are fresh and other teams kind of smell blood in the water, they're going to lowball you some offers. You're maybe not going to get the value that you would hope to get for a player like that in a trade. So with Elias, the Rangers waited it out and they still did not get equal value for him. He was a top 10 pick. They ended up settling for a second round pick, but they used that pick to draft Will Cooley. There was a player they coveted in that spot and they were ultimately happy with the way that it turned out. So I think they're not afraid to play the waiting game with Kravtsov. They'll hold him until the offseason. They can hold him beyond that if they really wanted to, if they feel like a team doesn't ultimately come up with an offer to their liking. So there's a lot of factors here, but the most immediate question is, once that KHL season is over, even though we know both sides would probably prefer a divorce because of the fact that the Rangers aren't going to rush the trade, they might turn around and say, listen, hey, we'll recall you. You're welcome to come back. We're not going to make you any promises. We're not going to tell you you're definitely going to have a lineup spot. You might be a healthy scratch. You might have to go to Hartford, but we'll welcome you back if you want to come back. And that would put the onus on him to make a decision there. And I would wonder, I'd be curious what he would do. Like I said, it's been a little quiet on all these fronts recently. And I think both sides are just trying to not make any waves and not create any PR headaches for themselves right now. And it still could be a while. Like, I think the KHL playoffs start March 1st. And so, if his team actually has the highest or tied for the highest points total in the KHL right now. So they could go on a run. He might not be available till late April, but if they get knocked out early, he could be available sometime in March. So once that happens, the Rangers will have a decision to make, and then he will have a decision to make.
It's crazy to me, and you touched on this just a second ago as well, but just the very simple fact that this all could have been avoided if either A, the Rangers just put him on the opening night roster, or B, he had accepted his assignment to Hartford. They would have called him back up in like 2 games, because I don't remember who it was, but I know somebody came out of the lineup, and you got to figure he would have been the first person called back up. And, we have, again, this entire saga with Kraftsoff now. 2 other players that I wanted to kind of lump together here. I mean, they're kind of, joined at the hip, so to speak. But Franiaire and Caco, obviously both, first overall pick, second overall pick in back-to-back years, respectively. And, they've both had their moments and they've both contributed to the team this year. And, at times I've come on the podcast and kind of stuck up for them when fans have been, getting frustrated with them. But do you have a sense with, how the Rangers feel about both these guys? Do they feel good about their development, or is there any okay, come on guys, it's time to pick it up a little bit? I mean, any sense for where the Rangers stand there with those two?
Well, they're definitely preaching patience. I'm sure ideally they would like a little more point production out of both of them. I think with Caco in particular, the feeling has been that his overall game he's made a lot of strides. I think that they like his play for the most part. I think they would like to see more consistent point production. Of course, that kind of goes without saying. Same thing with Lafreniere. I think Lafreniere hasn't had the well-rounded game quite to the level of Caco's so far this season. He's also a year younger. It's a tough conversation because everybody wants these guys to pop right away. And I know it kind of gets old hearing you talk about patience and hearing you say, not everybody's Connor McDavid and all these kind of things. I do believe that they have come around on this, and Caco really has been in the top 6 all season, so he hasn't had a lack of opportunities. But Lafreniere, they've bounced him around. He's been on the third line quite a bit. What we saw going into the break was that they gave him, a string, I think it was 3 games in a row where he got to play on the top line with Zibanejad and Kreider. I really do believe that the Rangers are going to come out of the break, keeping them as the top line, allowing him to get an extended run there. And I think it's important that they do that because, a lot of people point to time on ice, and yes, his time on ice is definitely lower than if you look at any other number 1 overall pick in their second season. But it's not just about time on ice. It's about the situational usage. And when he's buried in the bottom 6 and not playing a lot in the third period of close games, you're not giving him a whole lot of development opportunities. And I think they need to sort of take the leash off a little bit, understand that there are going to be mistakes, but they're in a strong position as far as the standings go. The Eastern Conference is really not a whole lot. I mean, as far as positioning, there's going to be a lot of jockeying, but there's not a whole lot of intrigue about which are the 8 teams that are going to get in. We pretty much know who the 8 teams that are. The Rangers have really helped themselves with having such a strong second half. I think you can afford to say, okay, we're going to give you 10, 15 games in this spot. Understand that mistakes might be made, but understand also that it's time for us to put more on your plate. So I think Lafreniere, you're very likely to see him come out of this break on the top line. And then Caco, I think that gives him an opportunity to go back with Panarin and Strome on the second line, which, if you remember, going back around Thanksgiving, he had been playing on that line all season. They were red hot going into that game right the day before Thanksgiving against the Islanders. And then they made the surprising decision to move Caco up to the top line. I think that line has been okay. And I know, especially if you look at a lot of the underlying numbers and metrics, their shot rates and all that are actually pretty good. Their scoring chance rates are pretty good. But Caco individually had the most success when he was with Panarin and Strome. And I think it would behoove the Rangers to go back to that alignment. So I think that crystallizes your top 6. Now, ultimately, at the trade deadline, are the Rangers going to be looking for a forward who might be an upgrade in their top 6? Absolutely. There's no question about that. They are shopping for forwards right now. But for the time being, I don't think that they could do anything better for the development of both of those guys than putting them in the top 6 coming out of this break. They're going to have 4 practices before this first game on the 15th against the Bruins. Let them get some practices under their belt with that line. Let them feel confident, like, hey, we're going to let you guys roll here for a while and see what happens, because that might be the spark that they need. Both guys have shown signs. I don't think I obviously think it's way too early to give up on either guy, but they were drafted because they were such potent point producers, Caco in Finland and Lafreniere in the Canadian Junior League. So at some point you want the points to pop, and the best way for the points to pop is going to be letting them play with your high-end skill players in the top 6. And I think that's the obvious move for the Rangers to make now.
Yeah, for sure. And, you mentioned the idea of possibly bringing in, a top 6 type of forward, at or near the trade deadline this season. Definitely want to do a little bit of trade talk with you, at some point during this episode. So might as well just go ahead and dive into it. But I mean, there's names that are out there. Maybe a JT Miller reunion makes some sense. Riley Smith's name has come up every now and then. One that seemed pretty out there, but I've almost kind of talked myself into it as far as liking it, is Claude Giroux. It would just be bizarre to see him as a Ranger at this point. But I mean, what are you thinking, man? Like, who would be your top choice? Who do you think the Rangers really like as far as forwards are concerned?
Well, top choice. See, this is another thing where there's a lot of factors to consider. I think the Rangers, unless they are sending salary back or convincing another team to retain salary, they are almost exclusively in the 1-year rental market. They cannot just trade picks and prospects for a guy who's under contract for multiple years. I mean, I guess if you talk about a guy like JT Miller, if they were willing to let Strome go next in the offseason, then maybe you could view him as a replacement. I haven't sensed a whole lot there. It's possible, but I don't know if Miller has been their focus. I don't really know if they particularly have a focus right now, to be completely honest with you. I think that they feel the longer they wait, the more teams will ultimately decide, okay, we've fallen out of the playoff race. We're going to make guys available. The closer to the trade deadline that they get, I think they feel like things will heat up more. They'll have more options. They might not have to overpay as much. I think if they pulled the trigger on a deal right now, they'd probably have to overpay a little bit more than when things come down to the deadline. So a lot of fans have been asking me this recently. I don't know if they have a top number 1 target right now. I don't know if they think that anything is set in stone. I think that they are going to wait until closer to the deadline. It's not till March 21st. So we have a month and a half until we get there. So I think they're still kind of waiting to see what materializes, how the market plays out. As far as in an ideal scenario, these are all names that are floated. You don't know for sure if these teams are going to end up trading these guys. But for me, if you slid Tomas Hertl, I've been talking about him for like 2 years. If you slid him from the San Jose Sharks into the middle of that lineup, and you could make a permanent move with Chytil to the wing, and then right down the middle, your top 3 centers are Zibanejad, Hertl, and Strome. I mean, that's about, I don't think you're going to find a move that solidifies the lineup as well as that one has, and Hertl's having an outstanding season. I've written this before. I like Joe Pavelski a lot from the Dallas Stars. I think he would be a really good fit for them. A couple of the names that you touched on. I mean, Giroux is a guy that I think a lot of people started thinking about over the weekend because of the NHL All-Star game. I did ask around a little bit about, is this whole like not trading in the division thing, is that something that would be a huge deterrent in that situation? People have reminded me that those trades have happened before. It has to be a deal, I think that really both sides feel like makes a lot of sense for them. And if there's other options, a team like the Flyers might be more inclined to send him out of the division. But I don't think you'd have the same rivalry sense that you would if they were trying to make a deal, like, let's say, with the Islanders or even with the Blue Jackets. If you're talking intra-division, I think the whole JD thing and the way that he left might complicate that. So the Flyers don't seem like the craziest idea to me, considering that a lot of people believe that they're going to trade Giroux, and I think he would be a pretty good fit for the Rangers. But there's also a chance that if the asking price is too rich for a lot of these big name guys, these are all-star caliber players, and Hertl, Pavelski, and Giroux that we're talking about, that they could end up with a guy who's more of a middle six kind of forward. I know that wouldn't be the sexiest thing for Rangers fans, but I do think that they've looked at some guys that they feel like, would be defensively responsible, that could help them in little areas like that. I think for me, they really need more scoring depth. Their secondary scoring, when you get beyond really 5 guys, Zibanejad, Strome, Kreider, Panarin, and Fox. After that, there's a huge drop-off as far as where they're getting their scoring from. So for me, I would want somebody who's going to be able to chip in goals and who's going to be able to help you out with your secondary scoring issues, especially at 5-on-5. But I think, if it ends up being less of a splashy name, that would not surprise me at all. So we'll see. There's a lot of time. We're gonna see this thing materialize more. You're gonna see teams get hot coming out of the break. You're gonna see teams drop off coming out of the break, and that will change the overall feel of the market. But I absolutely anticipate the Rangers will acquire someone. It's just a matter of who, and everybody wants the answers now. But it's gonna be, I think, probably a month or so before we get a definitive answer.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun storyline to track for sure. And there's one other player, switching our attention to defensemen real quick here. His name comes up all the time. You might even know who I'm about to say, but you hear Jacob Chychrun's name come up. I mean, he's been connected to like every team in the NHL, I feel like, but the Rangers seem to have some interest. I've been trying to make sense out of this, and the way Chychrun would fit with the Rangers. I believe he's under contract for another 3 seasons after this year at $4.5 million a pop. And I don't know. I mean, I look at the Ranger defensemen. I mean, the top 4, I'd put them up against just about any other quartet in the league. I mean, they got to be up there. And then, you've got a bunch of young defensemen. Braden Schneider has hit the ground running. Obviously, they like Lundqvist. They like Zach Jones. I don't know. To me, Jacob Chychrun, acquiring that contract, plus whatever you would have to give away to Arizona, I've been lukewarm at best to this idea. But, I mean, Vince, can you make any sense out of this to me? I mean, do you see him as a fit? And do you think that move makes sense for the Rangers on some level?
At the risk of making myself look foolish, I don't think there's anything there. I think there are certain times when a name gets floated somewhere on the internet, who knows who starts some of these things, and people pick it up and run with it. Like, that's just the world that we live in today. The sense that I've gotten is that Chychrun is not anything the Rangers are chasing very much. Maybe they've made calls on him. That's not out of the realm of possibility. I think they've made a lot of calls. I think Chris Drury has really tried to get a feel for as many possibilities as he can. But I've been told that there's not much there. I don't see too much logic behind it. I've been repeatedly told that forward is the priority, not defenseman. So Jacob Chychrun, I think that's something that it seems to me, because a lot of people are sending that to me, but I'm like, where did this really come from? I think to me, that seems like one of those things that got floated somewhere on Twitter, and a lot of people picked it up and ran with it. And there's not a whole lot of sourcing there, at least as far as my sourcing. Maybe somebody has something that I don't have, but I have not. I've asked about it a couple times because it's come up and I've been asked about it, but I have never gotten the sense that the Rangers were really involved in Chychrun very much.
Fair enough. Something else that I definitely want to ask you about, obviously, as the world slowly starts to get back to normal a little bit, you've been able to do your job in person and obviously travel with the team and all that stuff. And obviously new coach this year, Gerard Gallant. Do you get is there anything different in the locker room? Cause you've obviously been in there. I mean, do these guys, and I like David Quinn for the record. I'm not looking to bash Quinn or anything. I think he did a good job getting this team at least pointed in the right direction, but I mean, do these guys carry themselves differently? Is there anything tangibly that's different in that locker room that you can put your finger on under Gallant rather than with Quinn?
Well, to set the record straight, we're not in the locker room this year. So that is the one thing that we're still waiting on and hoping for and keeping our fingers crossed that we'll have next season.
Gotcha.
This is much different from the previous season where we were Zoom only and we never saw anybody in person beyond going to home. The only thing we went in the previous season that we did was go to home games. Mm-hmm. Now, like you said, I'm back on the road. I am back to talking to the players in person, but it's like a podium thing. You do get chances, before the interview, after the interview, to chat with players a little bit. You'll run into them in arenas sometimes. You'll run into them in different cities sometimes. So definitely have had more contact with the players this season than I did last season, but it's still not open locker room where we're walking in. And that's the thing that I miss the most personally, is because that's where you got a chance to sort of see what the feeling in the room really is, talk to guys in a less formal setting, whether it be about family stuff or joking around or just getting to know guys a little bit better. So to me, from the reporting standpoint, that was the best way for me to come up with a lot of different ideas and be able to do your own unique thing. So I definitely missed that. I know I'm sure any hockey reporter would tell you the same thing. We're very much hoping that we get locker room access back next year. And that will also make it a lot easier for us to each kind of tell unique stories and pull guys aside and do one-on-one interviews and things of that nature. But we do get to spend more time around the players. I am in the practice facility every day for every practice. So you see the interactions between coaches and players and all that kind of stuff. And I think, to me, and I've written about this before, the main difference between Gallant and Quinn is that Gallant is much more hands-off. He lets the players do their thing, police themselves, have fun. He demands hard work. He wants his team to have this blue collar work ethic and be gritty and be physical and all that kind of stuff. But as long as you're doing that, as long as you're giving him the effort that he demands, as far as practice days and off the ice stuff, he lets you do your thing. I don't think he's the kind of coach who's texting players often or really trying to do a whole lot with them away from the rink. Whereas David Quinn, I think, was a little more involved in that way. And you could go both ways. I mean, some players might prefer a coach who they feel like they're friendlier with. Some players might prefer a coach who you show up, he coaches you, you go home and you don't hear from him. I think Gallant is definitely more of the latter. And I do think that with some of the people on the Rangers, whether it be some of the veteran guys who have been around, like Kreider and Zibanejad and Strome, or some of the new guys they brought in, like Gaudreau and Reeves, I think that has put the ownership on them. And a few of the guys have said it, that they feel like it's given them more leeway to lead in the way that they see fit, to do things their own way and to create their own culture in the locker room. And I think that has obviously had a positive effect on the Rangers so far this season.
Yeah, for sure. And, something else, I think we've even talked about it a couple of times in the past, but, we've both been covering this team for a couple of years. Do you have any sense if and when the Rangers will ever name a captain? Personally, I don't think it will happen this year. And at this point, I don't even think it should, because they're having a great season. So why mess with anything? But any idea of if this will happen, when it might happen, going into the next year, maybe?
I'm done guessing. It's not going to happen this year. I'll tell you that. It's definitely not happening this season.
Yeah.
Maybe before next season, but I thought that coming into this season, I think that the players have made it pretty clear that it's not a big deal to them. Chris Kreider, I think, was the guy who said it. He was like, honestly, this is a bigger deal for fans and the media than it is for us. I think they kind of like it. There's not one guy who gets all the pressure on his shoulders. I think that they have a pretty good, diverse leadership group. Kreider, to me, is the guy who I think really sets the tone. He's the guy that, especially when things aren't going well, after a loss, those type of things, really is good at sending the right message and getting the team back to the basics and back to the principles that they want. But they all lead in different ways. I think Jacob Trouba is a guy that I've heard repeated stories about in the last couple of years, has really stepped up as a leader. I think he's a guy whose voice carries a lot of weight, and he's the kind of guy who it seems will say something during an intermission if the team needs to turn things around or things of that nature. I think Mika is a quiet leader that especially a lot of the young forwards on the team, they really look up to him in a lot of ways. And then even guys that don't, Strome is a guy that we talked about before, who I think really has a very positive influence. And I think he's the kind of guy that takes younger players aside and takes a lot of ownership and is a little more vocal than a guy like Mika. But even some of the guys that don't wear letters, like Reeves, I think has had a really positive influence on the locker room. I think a lot of guys respect him. They've all talked about the swagger that they have with him on the team now and how he's just made them a more confident group overall. So I think everybody kind of has their own thing, their own strengths, their own weaknesses, and they feel like they all complement each other pretty well. So the captain thing, I think the more that they have success without it, and the more that the players express that it's not a big deal to them, I think that really turns down the pressure on Drury or Gallant to make much of a decision on it. I think that they're Gallant said right off the bat, I didn't have a captain when I was in Vegas. I don't think it's a big necessity. I don't find it that big of a deal. So to me, this is my preference for now. Maybe next year they reassess, but I don't even know who you would say the front runner is at this point. Like I said, for me, I think if I had to pick someone, I would say Kreider probably fits the mold the best. But Kreider also isn't a big rah-rah kind of guy. So I don't think he's given a lot of fiery speeches. And not that you need that from a captain, but I think they all kind of wear different hats and it works for them. And I haven't sensed that it's something they're talking about much right now, to be honest. So if they go into next season with that one, it really wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And something else I wanted to ask you about, were you at the Henrik Lundqvist game with his jersey going to the rafters? You were there for that night, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, what was that like, man? Because I'm sure I'm not the only Ranger fan who wishes I could have been in the building that night. I'm sure we've got people listening to this that wish they were there. Some of them maybe even were there. But, man, just try to put us into the building on that night and what that was like if you could.
Yeah, it was really cool to be there for that. I wrote about this. I think that there was a special, I mean, I haven't been there for other jersey retirement ceremonies, so I'm sure that they were special and unique in their own way. But what struck me that night that I kept thinking about was when you looked at the most recent jersey retirement guys from that 94 team in particular, there was 4 of them: Graves, Messier, Leach, Richter. So they all kind of share, even though Messier was the leader of that team, they all kind of share those memories. And I think fans, when they think back of that 94 team in particular, they think of all those guys. Lundqvist is most likely going to be the only guy from his era who gets his jersey retired. So I think that even though they didn't win a cup, they had so many great runs. And I know for a lot of fans, it was a very nostalgic time. I think fans are always going to think back of him singularly as the face of that era. And I think that's why there was a lot of feelings and emotions and love coming from fans in the days leading up to that, and especially at the ceremony. I mean, they, say what you will about Madison Square Garden, but they really do a pretty good job of doing things the right way in those situations and really playing up the event and having all the little details just the way that they want it to be. So I think they did a really good job of making it a special night. I said this on my podcast. The one thing that bothered me a little bit was during Lundqvist's speech, there was a lot of fans. I don't know if you heard this as much on TV, but in the arena, it was pretty apparent. There was a lot of fans that were yelling things out, and I didn't hear anything bad. It was like, hey, we love you, Henrik, stuff like that. But like, it was interrupting his speech a lot. He kept having to pause. There were certain parts where you couldn't hear him really well. So I do wish that people would have been a little more respectful in that moment and let him talk, because I think a lot of us wanted to hear what he had to say. But we also got to talk to him at the press conference prior to the jersey retirement ceremony. And the main thing that struck me about him was, after everything that he's been through in the last year and a half, getting his job taken away from him when Igor got called up, getting bought out by the team and not getting to play his final year of his contract, making the decision to sign with the Capitals, then having that opportunity stripped from him because of the heart surgery, which, I mean, the heart surgery thing alone, I'm sure really put a lot of things in life into perspective for him. That was a really turbulent year and a half for him. And I felt like what he was getting across that night was that he was at peace with the way that everything happened. He was very appreciative for his time with the Rangers. And I think that had to make you feel good that he really seemed to be in a good place mentally and emotionally. And that was my main takeaway from hearing him talk that day. But overall, it was really, really cool to be there. Definitely one of the most special nights of the season. And like I said, I think it had a lot of meaning for a lot of fans, especially people who grew up watching him and felt like he was such a big part of their childhood or, their college years or whatever it was. They're always going to remember him first and foremost when they think of that era. And I think that's really the connection that he has with a lot of fans.
Yeah, it's crazy. Something I mentioned on a previous episode of Locked On Rangers was that, I joined the Ranger fandom at a really good time. 1994, that was the first time I ever really followed the team. And obviously we know how that season ended. But man, Henrik Lundqvist, he's been there for like more than half my fandom, especially if you start with when he was drafted, which was in 2000. It's crazy to think about. He just became absolutely synonymous with Ranger hockey. Vince, this is a ton of fun as always. I want to put you on the spot here. Do you have a bold prediction for the second half of the season as it pertains to the Rangers? Anything you want to just kind of throw out there? Could be a player they trade for, could be somebody who has a big second half. Anything you got there?
I think that at least one of the two young forwards we talked about, either Franiaire or Caco, I think one of them is gonna make a stride, make a jump that everybody's been waiting for. I'm reluctant to say both. I don't want to make that bold of a prediction, but I do think that one of them, especially like I said, I'm really anticipating that they're going to get an extended run in the top 6, at least going toward the trade deadline. So I think that one of them will make a jump, and that will be something for fans to feel good about. I also, though, think that winning at the pace that they were winning earlier in the season, I don't know if I see that keeping up. Even if they're playing better overall, I do think there are reasons to question, okay, can they keep that up? Because they had one of the best records in the league in the first half of the season, which I don't think anybody saw coming. The only way that they sustain that is if Igor continues to play at this incredibly high level. And if he does, then you got to really seriously give him consideration as a Vezina Trophy candidate. But I would look for one of the young guys to make a jump for sure. And I do think that as far as the Rangers' final record, they've been vying for first place in their division. If they finish 3rd or 4th, I think that wouldn't surprise me at all. They're absolutely going to make the playoffs. I don't think that's a bold prediction at this point. I think if you look at the Eastern Conference standings, it's pretty clear who's going to be in and who's going to be out. But do I see them winning the division? Probably not. I think you're looking at a 3rd, 4th place finish. I think you're looking at them going into a playoff series as a probable underdog. What they do at the trade deadline could change that if they make a really big splash. But there's been a lot of positive growth for this team this year. But, their 5-on-5 play, I think, is still a concern moving forward. Their secondary scoring, I think, is still a concern moving forward. So I could see some positives, some negatives. They end up in that 3rd, 4th place range. They make the playoffs. They take their chances from there. You get a hot goalie like Igor, anything could happen. But, I'm not going to sit here and tell you they're going to win the Stanley Cup because I don't believe that they're quite there yet. But I think you're going to have an entertaining second half. I think this team has been really fun to cover for the first half. And I think, what's going to happen in the second half for a lot of different reasons is going to be really interesting to watch as well.
Yeah, it's been a ton of fun. You hit the nail on the head there. It's been a ton of fun covering this team this year and seeing them really take a massive step forward and kind of work their way out of this rebuild. And it's been great. And Vince, as always, man, it's a pleasure talking some Ranger hockey with you, and definitely looking forward to having you on again some point down the stretch this season, as long as you're up for it.
Anytime, John. Just reach out. Happy to do it.
All right, sounds good, man. And Ranger fans, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time.